Hi, this is Professor Charlie Evans, and this afternoon I'd like to talk a little bit about the Protestant Reformation that swept Europe in the early 16th century. The movement was most closely associated with the life of Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546, but there were other individuals involved both before him and after him. On the screen right now, you're looking at a reproduction of his famous 95 Theses, which started the Protestant Reformation and which date to October 1517 when, according to legend, Luther nailed the theses to the cathedral doors in Wittenberg. The theses were to prompt discussion within the Catholic Church about some Catholic Church practices and theology. Let me switch quickly here to a woodcut engraving of the supposed hammering of the theses to the cathedral door. I should note that historians have not really been able to pin down whether the hammering actually really did occur. There had been earlier attempts to reform the Catholic Church, namely those by Jan Hus, the Bohemian, and Wycliffe in England, but both of those attempts had failed, and Hus himself came to a rather bad end as a result of his attempts to reform the church. But by the early 16th century, the beginning of the 1500s, it was clear that there were issues troubling the church, that there were church practices that might not have been in accord with the best ideas of the church, the theology of the church. And one of those practices was something called the indulgence, or the sale of an indulgence. And basically, an indulgence was a mitigation or remission of a penance. And according to the church, when a believer had confessed a sin, the church would assign a penance that had to be done to kind of make up for that sin. And an indulgence was a way of mitigating that penance. It gets kind of technical in exactly what the church believed an indulgence was, but for the general population of the time, uh, those people believed that an indulgence was really a forgiveness of sin and a lessening of the time that one had to spend in purgatory in the afterlife. It gets really complicated here, but basically when someone died, they were either beautifully going to heaven, they were not so beautifully going to hell, or where there was this middle ground, purgatory, where someone had to spend some time to make up for their mistakes and sins in life. The people believed that by getting an indulgence, you could reduce that time in the purgatory. An indulgence, we're going to get a little bit more theory here. The church believed that as a result of the good works, the good lives of saints and other people over the centuries, that the church had accumulated a treasury of merit, a treasury of good deeds, so to speak, and that an indulgence was kind of a check on that treasury of good deeds and giving a piece of that good deeds to somebody else so that that could be used to offset their sinful thing. The problem was that the church needed money and that the church had organized fundraisers circulating through Europe at the time who were basically selling indulgence, selling these tickets of forgiveness so that the church could raise money. This infuriated some of the church believers at the time, and Martin Luther was one of these people who was infuriated by this church practice, and it just sounds really bizarre to us reading about it today, but this was a life or death matter to people living in the 15th and 16th centuries. And Luther thought this was so against the intent and mission of the Catholic Church that this was something that needed to be discussed. And so what he posted then in his 95 Theses were 95 statements, each a thesis, about some church practice or some church belief that he felt needed to be talked about and discussed, and hopefully revising church theology and church practice. And so, for example, um, thesis number 43, Christians should be taught that he who gives to a poor man or lends to a needy man does better than if he bought pardons or if he bought indulgences. Number 21, those preachers of indulgences are in error who say that by the indulgences of the Pope, a man is loosened, and saved from all punishment. Thesis number 1, that the whole life of a believer should be one of repentance. And then number 2, that this word cannot be understood as sacramental penance. What's interesting about the theses and the whole focus of the Reformation here was unlike what I talked about when I talked about the Renaissance, where the scholars and artists and believers in humanism as part of the Renaissance really believed that man was something to be not necessarily worshipped, but man was fit to be a subject for art, that man was fit to be studied. In the Reformation, we're getting back to the Christian point of view that man was necessarily evil, that man is evil, and that man is corrupt, which is a complete juxtaposition to what we saw with the Renaissance. But the Reformation and Renaissance are both taking place simultaneously. Luther's debates and his critique of the church met with fertile ground, and he eventually ended up establishing his own church, and that set off a tidal wave of other reformers and critics who went on to create their own church. And so by the end of the 16th century, by 1600 approximately, there were literally scores and scores of independent Christian churches in Europe that no longer had allegiance to the Pope and to the one Catholic Church. Unfortunately, this set off a long round of warfare between the Catholic Church itself and the Protestants, those who were protesting, those who had broken from the Catholic Church, mostly over initially possession of the material property of the church, and then later over control of territories and areas within the church. One last thing to be said about the Reformation, which is similar also to the Renaissance, is that it was probably only able to occur and spread and be successful as a intellectual religious movement because of the printing press. Because the printing press, which had just been invented about roughly 50 years prior to Luther's posting of the 95 Theses, the printing press allowed the ideas of the Protestant reformers to be printed and spread and read and find a wider audience than would have existed if there had been no printing press at the time. Okay, thank you.